This time, I want to talk about a topic that may seem relatively obscure, but is actually something many people in Hong Kong have heard of, a paranormal incident connected to the practice known as villain hitting. For many people, villain hitting is simply a folk custom or a way to release emotions. When life feels unlucky, work is not going well, or it seems like certain people are constantly getting in the way, they turn to the ritual hoping to push away bad fortune, feel a little relief, and believe that once it's done, everything is over. But the story I'm about to share is about what happened after someone took that step. After the ritual, a series of events began, things that were completely unexpected. It was only when fear truly set in that this person realized some doors, once opened, do not close so easily. Originally, villain hitting was not meant to target a specific individual. It began as a symbolic ritual, meant to strike away obstacles, misfortune, and negative influences in life, using physical action to represent the hope that things would start to go more smoothly. Because of this, what was being struck was not necessarily a real person, but a piece of paper, a symbol, or a projected target. The focus was not on causing harm, but on expressing rejection toward bad luck and setbacks through ritual. However, over time, this practice gradually changed, from striking away misfortune to targeting specific people. And when something that was once symbolic becomes personal and directed, the consequences it brings may no longer be just a matter of psychological comfort. The main character of this story, whom we'll call May, was still young in her early 20s. She was an ordinary office worker, living a routine much like most people in Hong Kong, commuting to work every day, going home after hours, nothing particularly unusual on the surface. But only she knew that she had been under constant pressure for a long time. The problem wasn't the workload itself, it was her supervisor. May's supervisor was a woman much older than her, highly emotional and unpredictable. On good days, she treated her subordinates as if they didn't exist. On bad days, she vented all of her frustration on them. She took credit during meetings and shifted responsibility whenever something went wrong. For May, this wasn't something that happened once in a while. It had become part of daily life. What troubled May the most wasn't being scolded, but the feeling of being constantly targeted and worn down. She had done everything she could to perform her duties well, yet no matter how hard she tried, it never seemed to be enough. For a period of time, May noticed that just thinking about going to work the next day made her chest feel tight, her whole body tense for no clear reason. Even so, she never seriously considered quitting. She understood that in reality, there weren't many options that allowed someone to simply walk away. Then one day, she met up with a close friend for a meal. As they talked about recent events, May found herself pouring out all of her frustrations at once. It was at that moment, half jokingly, that her friend suggested something May had never seriously considered before: villain hitting. On that day, May didn't tell anyone where she was going. She left home as usual. Along the way, she didn't feel anything in particular, just a slight sense of nervousness that she couldn't quite explain. When she arrived, the first feeling wasn't fear, but noise. The sound of slippers striking paper echoed constantly around her, mixed with low murmuring she couldn't understand. The air was filled with the smell of incense and burning paper. At first, May stood to the side and watched. One by one, people sat down, completed the ritual, and left. Some looked relieved afterward, as if a burden had been lifted. Others showed no expression at all and hurried away. For a brief moment, May felt that this place didn't seem like a simple outlet for frustration. Just as she was considering whether to turn around and leave, someone lifted their head from a darker corner and looked directly at her. That glance made May stop without realizing it. Only then did she notice that the person watching her was a woman seated in the corner. The area was dimly lit, with very little light overhead, and felt noticeably quieter than the rest. The woman appeared elderly, her hair streaked with gray, her back slightly hunched. In front of her were several small statues and a stack of neatly folded paper. When the woman saw May looking back, The corner of her mouth moved slightly before she spoke in a low voice, asking if May had come to perform the ritual. May froze for a moment and instinctively glanced around, making sure the woman was speaking to her. She had intended to say she was just passing by, but the words caught in her throat, and she ended up nodding instead. The woman calmly gestured for her to come over, saying she had just finished with someone and there was no need to wait. Her tone was flat, as if she had already expected May to stop. May looked at the other stalls, most of which had people lining up, the sounds of chanting and striking overlapping in the background. When she looked back at the corner, it was dark, but unusually quiet. After hesitating for a moment, she sat down. The woman didn't ask anything else. While arranging the papers on the table, she casually introduced herself, saying May could call her Sister Lynn. After May sat down, Sister Lynn confirmed the target of the ritual. When May quietly said her supervisor's name, she suddenly realized there was no turning back. Sister Lynn rearranged the items on the table. She first removed the brick that had been holding down the yellow paper, then reached under the table and took out a whetstone, placing it at the center. The surface of the stone was uneven, its edges clearly worn from repeated use. Next, she did not use the pair of slippers she had before. Instead, she slowly took another pair of shoes out of a cloth bag. The shoes were old-fashioned, their embroidery slightly faded, though the stitching was still clear. The soles were much harder than ordinary slippers. Sitting across from her, May watched the entire process and suddenly felt a sense of discomfort she couldn't quite explain. She had thought this would be a casual ritual, but everything happening in front of her felt far more serious than she had expected. When the first strike landed, the sound wasn't loud, but it was distinct. The strikes continued one after another, unhurried, yet each one landed firmly. When the final strike stopped, the surroundings suddenly fell quiet. Incense smoke continued to rise slowly, but on the table, there were no further movements. At that moment, May realized that something had already happened. After the ritual ended, Sister Lynn gathered the papers, placing them together with the remaining offerings into a metal basin and setting them on fire. When the burning was finished, Sister Lynn took out a triangularly folded yellow talisman from under the table and placed it on the surface, signaling for it to be taken. Before leaving, May glanced back unintentionally. The table had returned to its calm state, as if nothing had happened. But a brief thought surfaced. Had it really ended? A few days later, when May arrived at work, she noticed that her supervisor was absent. At first, she assumed it was just a late arrival, but by noon, the desk was still empty. Only after someone mentioned it quietly did she learn that the supervisor had twisted her ankle on the way to work. The injury was serious enough to require sick leave. Over the next few days, the office atmosphere became unusually calm. The familiar sounds of reprimands no longer echoed through the space, and work progressed more smoothly than before. After about a week, the supervisor finally returned. But compared to before, she was clearly different. She walked with a limp, looked visibly exhausted, and her presence had completely changed. She no longer raised her voice, and even her words became brief. No one knew what had happened. Slowly, people began whispering that she seemed like a completely different person. Not long after returning, the supervisor disappeared again. This time, it wasn't a short sick leave. She was absent for several days in a row. People quietly asked around, and eventually learned that her condition had suddenly worsened, requiring long-term rest. No one knew exactly what illness it was, only that the situation did not look optimistic. The company quickly made arrangements to redistribute her responsibilities, and she herself resigned without any formal farewell. Everything happened too fast, from a twisted ankle to a complete loss of authority to a sudden departure. Before long, no one in the office mentioned her name anymore, as if she had never truly existed. After everything had passed, May's life appeared to return to normal. She went to work, came home, and carried on as usual. For a while, she even convinced herself that what had happened before was nothing more than a coincidence. But before long, subtle and unexplainable irregularities began to surface, and they were happening to her. The first problem appeared in her apartment's lights. At first, they only flickered occasionally. May assumed the bulbs were old and replaced them without much thought. But the same issues soon began occurring in different rooms. Within a short period of time, she had changed several bulbs, yet the problem never fully went away. Not long after that, sounds started to be heard at night. Most of the time, it was late at night. Even though no one else was in the apartment, there would be noises that sounded like someone walking around the living room. The sounds weren't loud, but they were clear. Each time they stopped, only to return again after a while. Whenever the door was opened to check, no one was there. The doors and windows were secure, and nothing in the apartment showed any sign of being disturbed. These incidents didn't happen every day, but once they started, they would repeat several times before suddenly stopping. There was no clear pattern and no reasonable explanation. It was this intermittent, unexplainable state that slowly began to change everything. After that, the problem began to affect May's sleep. At first, she only had occasional dreams. The details were vague, and she could hardly remember them after waking up. But within a few days, the same dream began to repeat itself, almost exactly the same each time. In the dream, May found herself once again sitting in the same place where the ritual had been performed. The setup on the table was identical to that day. Sister Lynn sat across from her, lowering her head and repeating the same actions, everything proceeding as if following a set routine. Then, at a certain moment, she suddenly stopped and slowly raised her head. In the dream, May could clearly see that the person in front of her was no longer Sister Lynn, but her supervisor. She didn't speak. She simply looked at the table and then moved the brick that had been pressing down on the yellow paper. When the paper was lifted, what appeared underneath was no longer meant for anyone else. It was May's own name. The dream always ended at that exact moment. May would wake up in the same position every time, unable to fall back asleep. And the dream didn't happen just once. As the nightmares continued to repeat, May's daily routine began to suffer. She slept in short, broken intervals at night, her condition clearly deteriorating to the point where even ordinary daily life became exhausting. She didn't explain the details of the dreams to anyone, but she had a growing sense that the problem might be connected to the ritual she had taken part in that day. After some time, May decided to return to the place where the ritual had been performed, hoping to find Sister Lynn and get some answers. When she arrived, the stall was still there, but the person who had once sat in the corner was gone. In her place was another woman. When May asked about Sister Lynn, the woman replied simply that she hadn't seen her for quite some time, and that the spot had already been taken over by someone else. When asked further, she only added that Sister Lynn rarely interacted with others, and that her methods were considered rather heavy-handed. After that, she said nothing more. May didn't continue asking. She realized she no longer had any clear direction to follow. And the dream still did not stop. After failing to find Sister Lynn, May did not attempt to solve the problem in the same way again. A few days later, she went instead to a place where many people regularly went to pray, hoping to seek clarity through a different approach. She followed the usual steps, lighting incense, bowing, and drawing a fortune stick. When the fortune was revealed, its meaning was unfavorable. The interpreter only pointed out that the reading suggested recent missteps, a tendency to invite unrest, and that it was not advisable to deal with problems by targeting others. May did not bring up what had happened on her own, but under questioning, she eventually explained the situation briefly. After listening, the interpreter's expression grew noticeably serious. He only advised her to sincerely repent, stop all related actions, and focus on doing proper, upright things, allowing the matter to gradually be put to rest. When she left, May asked no further questions. She simply followed the advice she was given, completed what she was told to do, and returned to her regular life. After that, the nightmares began to lessen. After some time, the disturbances at home gradually disappeared. There were no more footsteps heard at night, and the lights no longer flickered without reason. Most importantly, the recurring dream never returned. Life seemed to fall back into its original rhythm, and on the surface, everything became calm again. May never brought up the ritual after that, nor did she try to use any similar methods to deal with her problems. If you found this story meaningful, feel free to like the video or leave a comment. Your thoughts, interpretations, or even quiet reactions are always welcome. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories rooted in real experiences, unexplained moments, and the spaces between belief and doubt, consider subscribing. Your support helps the channel continue sharing these stories. Thank you for listening and for staying with the story until the end.